In late March of 2020, a group of stubborn hikers approached Apache Peak on the Pacific Crest Trail. I say that these hikers were stubborn because at the exact moment that they were climbing this mountain, the world was in the process of shutting down due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so even though the government and the families of these hikers were literally begging them to get off the trail, well, they were still determined. After all, they had set out to hike the entire distance of the PCT from Mexico to Canada, and at this point, they were only a few weeks into their journey. There was no way that they were going to give up this early, despite all of the warnings and advisories and news coverage and fear-mongering. These hikers wouldn't have known it at the time, but as they climbed higher up the mountain, this virus, this pandemic, well, that would have been the last of their concerns. Something much more dangerous was on the horizon, and these hikers were about to walk straight into it. After a few miles of hiking, the trail suddenly disappeared. Mother Nature had dumped multiple feet of snow on the mountains, and this left the hikers with no choice but to traverse across a steep, icy slope with no trail to guide them. The first hiker in the group made it across successfully, but for the second hiker, 22-year-old Trevor Laher, the results would be much different. I'm sure that Trevor was a bit nervous as he took his first steps across this slope, but he would have had no idea about the horror that was about to happen. You see, folks, what happened next was an event so terrifying and honestly so heart-wrenching that it would go on to impact the history of the Pacific Crest Trail forever. And so without further ado, folks, this is the story of Trevor Laher. So I just said that this was Trevor's story. I mean, that's the best way to sum it up, I guess. But the truth is that this story goes much deeper than just him. It's also the story of his father, Doug. It's the story of the rest of Trevor's family. And it's the story of the Pacific Crest Trail community at large. And so, folks, this is a tough one to tell because I've frankly gotten to know Doug Laher over the last few years, but we're going to do it. Let's take a virtual trip right now to the Pacific Crest Trail. This trip costs you nothing except a click of that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. I mean, you're going to help us reach our goal of 500,000 subscribers, which we are so close to. So please hit that subscribe button. Okay, let's go. In the spring of 2020, Trevor Laher set out to accomplish a goal that he had held for literally years. That goal was to thru hike the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a footpath that runs border to border from Mexico all the way up to Canada. Now, those of you that are regular viewers of the channel, well, you probably already know about the PCT, and most of you probably know that I myself actually set out to hike the PCT back in 2022. The PCT is a total piece of cake. I mean, it's only 2,650 miles long, and that's sarcasm. As of right now, I've completed everything except for the northernmost 170 miles of it. I'm gonna finish it soon, but that's besides the point. Most people will take around 4 to 6 months to complete a thru hike like this, and so obviously a lot of sacrifices have to be made in order to make that happen. I mean, most people don't just find themselves with like 6 months of spare time in their hands, and so instead, prospective thru hikers have to plan far in advance so that their life can accommodate such a long journey. For a lot of people, myself included, this means quitting a job in order to go hike. And for other people, like Trevor Laher, for instance, this means restructuring the entirety of your academic studies. So during his junior year of college at Ohio State, by the way, Trevor told his father, Doug, that he would be attempting to graduate a semester early so that he had time to go hike the PCT before he entered the job market. This meant that Trevor would be cramming extra classes into his final 3 semesters. And that is just absolutely insane to have that much extra course load. And it's even more impressive, by the way, when you consider that Trevor's major was computer science. Now, I'm probably a bit biased in saying this because I was also a computer science major, but then again, I guess that means I can tell you from firsthand experience that computer science is a tough major. The fact that Trevor had the confidence, the skills, and clearly the intelligence to take on all these extra classes in his final 3 semesters and graduate early is extremely impressive. There's no way that I could have done that. And I bet that when he made that decision and he committed to that decision, he probably knew that it was going to take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Okay, maybe it wouldn't have taken blood, but it probably would have taken some sweat and some tears. And speaking of sweat, by the way, if you hike or you exercise or you do anything that, causes you to sweat, well, you need to be intentional about replacing your electrolytes. And it's for that reason that I need to tell you about Drink Element, who is the sponsor of this video. I'm a sweater, folks. Whenever I'm hiking, I am just absolutely drenched in sweat. And very early on, I realized that if I sweat a lot and then I just drink a bunch of water, but I don't replace my electrolytes, well, I feel terrible. I get cramps, I get fatigued, and if you find yourself in a similar situation, you need to check out Drink Element. They are the #1 electrolyte drink mix company out there. It's not even close. They taste amazing. They have so many awesome flavors like grapefruit salt or citrus salt or orange salt. They even have some more, like, I always call them out of the box flavors, more creative flavors that you probably don't see in other places like chocolate salt or mango chili, for instance. They really go above and beyond when it comes to their flavors, which I think is super impressive. And another thing that's really impressive about Drink Element is that they don't load their electrolyte drink mix with a bunch of sugar and a bunch of other crap that you don't even understand what it is, right? They don't do that. And so many other companies do. This is super important. All you're gonna get in Drink Element is an amazing taste, and you're gonna get the electrolytes that you need to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay hydrated when you're sweating a lot. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to pause the video. I want you to go to the description of the video and click on that link or type in drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking into your web browser. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. When you do that and you make a purchase through that link, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, so you can try all of their amazing and creative flavors like I talked about earlier. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link at the top of the description. Guys, at the end of this video, I'm gonna be talking about a charity movement that has sprung out of this story, and a huge reason why I'm able to support charities like I try to call out in my videos is because of amazing sponsors like Element. They make it possible, frankly, and so thank you so much to Drink Element, and let's get back to the story. So when Trevor first told his parents about his intentions to go hike the PCT, they were understandably a little bit resistant. This is something that a lot of thru hikers go through. I mean, it's not always easy getting loved ones who aren't as familiar with the trail on board with the adventure. And for a few months, actually, Trevor's plans to hike the PCT created a lot of tension between him and his parents. However, they did eventually come around, and Trevor's father, Doug, actually began researching the trail and learning about the trail just as much as Trevor. Now, Doug wasn't going to hike the trail himself, but he was actually getting very excited to follow Trevor's journey. I mean, it really didn't take long at all before Doug had done a complete 180 in terms of Trevor's hike. I mean, not only was he now just supportive of it, but he wanted to be involved with it as much as he possibly could. And by the way, Doug definitely wasn't a long distance backpacker or a thru hiker, but he wasn't a stranger to backpacking either. And he had spent a lot of time day hiking and even overnighting backpacking camping with Trevor in the years leading up to 2020. This is important because Doug had been able to witness firsthand just how alive Trevor felt when he was in the wilderness. And Doug was proud. He was proud of Trevor for taking on such an ambitious goal. And yet another testament to how smart Trevor was, frankly, and how hard he worked, he was actually able to secure a job at Microsoft before he graduated. And so because of this job and this obligation, This meant that Trevor didn't really have time to hike the entire PCT. Instead, he had from mid-March to about mid-July to make it as far north on the trail as he could. I can only imagine that securing this job at Microsoft, which is just super impressive in and of itself, I can only imagine that put his parents at ease. I mean, knowing that their son had stable employment lined up for when he finished the hike, and Trevor would end up successfully graduating from college early. And then, on March 9th, 2020, he traveled to Phoenix, Arizona with Doug, his father, and his sister, Olivia. Their plan was to spend some time there with some family members, I believe Trevor and Olivia's grandparents, before Doug and Olivia would fly back home to Texas. At that point, Trevor would then be driven to the southern terminus of the PCT by his grandparents, and after that, he would start hiking north. They landed in Phoenix, and then all of a sudden, this plan nearly unraveled. You'll recall that, mid-March of 2020 is exactly when the world began to change due to the coronavirus pandemic and government's response to it around the world. I mean, it was just absolutely exploding at this time. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. And so just before Doug and Olivia were set to fly back to Texas, Doug passively suggested that maybe Trevor should join them in going home and cancel his hiking plans altogether. Now, this is definitely not what Trevor wanted to hear, but you can kind of understand why Doug did this, right? I mean, I just said it there. There was so much unknown at this point. It was a very scary time. And so I hope that Trevor was able to at least appreciate where his father was coming from. But I guess regardless of whether or not he did, well, Trevor didn't listen to Doug. Trevor was still going to go hike the PCT, and Doug knew that convincing his son to give up on this, especially only a few days before he was going to start, was pretty much a losing argument entirely. And, well, he was right. Trevor had spent years dreaming of hiking the PCT. I mean, he had completely altered half of his college experience to make it happen. And of course, he had been training intensely for months and months, getting his body ready for this. Nothing was going to stop Trevor from going out and accomplishing this goal. Though I will say, this was the first of many attempts that Doug would make to try to convince him not to do it. So Doug and Olivia fly back to Texas without Trevor, of course, and they do this on March 13th. Doug later wrote, quote, saying, "Our final goodbyes at the airport, Trevor gave me a longer embrace than usual, much longer, in fact. And in that embrace, he whispered to me, 'I love you, Dad. Thanks for all you've done to help make this adventure a reality for me.'" And to that, Doug replied, quote, "Go hike the shit out of that trail." On March 16th, 2020, Trevor's grandparents dropped him off at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail, right on the Mexican border. This photo right here was taken at the very beginning of Trevor's hike while he was standing at that southern terminus. It's an awesome photo. There's tons of photos of other hikers like this out there. There's even one of me, frankly, when I started the PCT. And there's nothing, unusual about this photo per se. There's nothing disturbing until you learn what happened next. After this photo was taken, Trevor began his walk north. And for the first few days, things went basically according to plan. Now, a lot of you know this, but a lot of you probably don't. Contrary to what a lot of people think, a through hike like the Pacific Crest Trail is actually quite a social experience. It's like, yeah, you're in the wilderness, you're in the woods, but the truth is that thousands of people attempt the PCT every single year, and you end up seeing the same people day in and day out as you all kind of move north together. Because of this, Trevor was able to make some friends with other hikers, and he formed what many people call a trail family. It's essentially a crew of like-minded hikers moving up the trail together, camping together, and going into town to resupply together. So everything goes great on the first few days. Trevor's making these friends, but then on day 5, Trevor faced what would be the first real challenges of his hike. He actually faced two challenges, two completely different challenges to be exact. It was on day 5 that Trevor and his trail family got caught in a very nasty late winter storm, and they became completely soaking wet in freezing cold temperatures, which is a very, very dangerous situation. They couldn't even find like a safe, protected area to set up camp, and so they essentially just had to suffer. They had to just tough it out. Thankfully, they ended up being okay. They did tough it out. This is something that every thru hiker goes through, and fortunately, nobody was harmed during this very humbling experience for the hikers. However, once Trevor managed to warm himself up, get safe, get comfortable again, and turn on his cell phone, well, he immediately fell into the second challenge of March 19th, 2020. You see, folks, it was on this very day that the Pacific Crest Trail Association, which is the organization that manages the PCT, well, they advised all hikers to avoid the trail due to the pandemic. They urged hikers who were planning on starting to cancel their trips, and they also urged hikers that were already on the trail to leave immediately. And at the very same time, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a stay-at-home order, and, well, it wasn't long before Doug was once again arguing for Trevor to come home, although this time he had much clearer justification and he was definitely a lot more determined to make it happen. Trevor, understandably so, still didn't want to leave the trail. His father argued that the PCT wasn't going anywhere. You know, Trevor could always return the following year or another year sometime in the future. Doug argued that Trevor was actually being a little selfish in continuing to hike. He was putting locals in the towns along the PCT at risk. And he also argued that Trevor was being inconsiderate of his wishes and the wishes of his mother and his sister. Doug was so determined to get his son to come home from the PCT that he even considered cutting Trevor's finances off. However, all of this failed to persuade Trevor. It might have been a little easier to convince him if the stay-at-home order had been issued before he had actually started his hike, but he was already out there. He had already made friends at this point. He had already faced physical adversity in the mountains, and he had persevered. I mean, folks, Trevor was doing the damn thing, and until he was literally faced with legal repercussions for continuing to hike, he made it very clear that he was not gonna stop. And again, I can't really blame him. Trevor told Doug, quote, "This is my dream, Dad. I'm living it right now. The views, the vistas, the things I get to see are the most beautiful that I've ever seen in my life. If I lose this opportunity now, I'll lose it forever." Eventually, Doug and the rest of the Laher family, well, they gave in. It was clear that Trevor was not gonna come home, and so rather than waste any more energy trying to convince him to come home, they instead decided to use this energy to keep him safe and to support him. His father, Doug, and the rest of the Laher family became Trevor's eyes and ears when it came to updates on COVID and updates on trail conditions. They would have a lot more time to spend researching and reading the news and stuff than Trevor would, because he was in the mountains hiking, and so the family would relay any new information that they found so that Trevor, could just focus on hiking safely without any distractions. The family would also send him boxes of food and supplies in town so that Trevor would continue to stay well equipped and, of course, well fed. And so Trevor and his trail family pressed on, and they actually very quickly crossed the first real milestone for PCT hikers, which is the 100-mile mark. Now, 100 miles is a drop in the bucket when you think of how long the entire PCT really is, but given everything that Trevor had gone through in those first 100 miles, I'm sure that it felt pretty damn good. However, at this point, one of the other hikers in Trevor's family, his name was Leo, well, Leo was not feeling very good. Leo had suffered a knee injury, which is a very common ailment at the beginning of a long hike like this. And so just after the 100-mile mark, Leo decided to take a few days off. He decided to head to a hotel and rest in order to hopefully let his body heal. And before he got a ride off the trail, he actually asked Trevor and the rest of his trail family if they wanted to join him. After all, in addition to just resting their bodies, it would have been a great opportunity for the hikers to kind of just take a deep breath and assess if it was a good idea to keep hiking during the growing pandemic. It would have been much easier to research all of this and to make this decision while you're sitting in a hotel room with Wi-Fi rather than when you're in the mountains out in the cold on your phone, barely having any service. But regardless of this, Trevor and the rest of his trail family turned Leo down. Leo later recalled Trevor telling him, quote, "We're just going to keep going till someone tries to stop us." And thus, Leo parted ways with Trevor and the rest of the group, unable to convince them to take the rest days with him. Leo would go on to spend a few days laying low in the hotel, watching TV, and more specifically, watching the news. And this opportunity to kind of reconnect with the outside world made Leo realize that continuing to hike against the wishes of the PCTA and against the wishes of the state of California was probably a bad idea. Leo would never make it back to the PCT after this. He left the trail and he went home. The main reason why I'm telling you this part of the story is because, well, one can only wonder what would have happened if Trevor and the rest of the group had joined Leo during those days off instead of continuing to hike. If that had happened, maybe Trevor would have finally realized the severity of the pandemic, and maybe he would have made the decision to go home. Or maybe he wouldn't have. But either way, if Trevor had gone into town with Leo, it's likely that I wouldn't be making this video for all of you right now. And I genuinely wish that was what happened, because after Trevor and his trail family continued on past the 100-mile marker, they were hiking directly into a death trap. And the worst part is they didn't even realize it. So the group continued on until they made it to a popular restaurant that is actually pretty much directly on the PCT called the Paradise Valley Cafe. North of this cafe, the PCT crosses the road and then it enters the San Jacinto Mountains. And folks, this is a section of trail that is largely underestimated by hikers. Just as an example, when I hiked through the San Jacintos on my PCT hike, I was very surprised at how difficult the terrain was compared to the previous 150 miles that I had hiked up to that point. But unlike Trevor and unlike a lot of other PCT hikers, I started my hike much later in the season. I started in May. And so while the San Jacinto section was tough for me, it's not like I encountered any snow or ice or even any difficult weather conditions at all. For hikers that start the trail in March, like Trevor did, or even in April, these late winter conditions are very, very real, and it's often the first time that hikers will encounter these conditions while they head north. An early entry into these mountains requires hikers to carry micro spikes for their feet in order to give them better grip, and an ice axe to aid with slippery traverses or to save your life in case you fall and you need to self-arrest. Well, that's what hikers should carry anyways. But every single year, unprepared hikers enter the San Jacintos without the ice axe and without the micro spikes, not realizing that they're necessary because up until that point, they hadn't needed them at all. And so because of all that, it's been my, albeit anecdotal, observation that the San Jacinto section of the PCT is probably the most dangerous on the entire trail. Numerous hikers have passed away or gone missing in this section, including 2 hikers that I've actually talked about in previous videos. David O'Sullivan went missing there, and John Donovan also went missing there, although he was eventually found years later. Many hikers will actually hitch into the town of Idlewild before they enter the San Jacintos. And this gives the hikers time to rest, it gives them time to resupply, and it gives them time to prepare for the difficult terrain ahead of them. This is actually what I did when I was on the PCT, but a lot of hikers will actually just head straight into the San Jacintos first and then enter Idlewild on a side trail after the first day of difficult hiking is behind them. This is what Trevor and his trail family ended up doing. Trevor left the Paradise Valley Cafe on March 26th and then later made camp on a ridgeline. That evening, he actually had some cell service, and so he gave his dad a call. Him and Doug spoke on the phone, and Doug said that Trevor sounded tired, and he talked about the aggressive pace that the group had been maintaining over the previous few days. Trevor told Doug that the very next day, the group would be entering the town of Idlewild and then taking a few days off, and then returning to the PCT with additional equipment like microspikes and an ice axe. Doug would have had no way of knowing it, but this conversation on the phone with Trevor would end up being the last time that he would ever speak with his son. The next day, at some point in the afternoon, Doug became aware of some news reports which stated that a hiker had died on the PCT. Very close, by the way, to the location where Trevor had camped the night before. This obviously set off many alarm bells in Doug's head. It gave him a lot of anxiety, but at first he was actually able to keep himself calm. At this point, the name of the deceased hiker had not yet been released, and even though Trevor wasn't answering phone calls that Doug was now making to him, Doug knew that at this point in the day, Trevor was likely still hiking and, well, he wouldn't have had cell service. And besides all of that, Doug knew that Trevor was carrying identification with him. He had a driver's license on him, and he was also hiking with other people. He was hiking with his trail family. The news reports stated that a rescue of the deceased hiker had been attempted, but that the hiker had passed before rescuers reached them. Therefore, those rescuers would have been able to identify the hiker and break the news to the hiker's family. Doug hadn't received any contact from the authorities. He hadn't received any contact from search and rescue, and therefore he remained cautiously optimistic that Trevor was fine. However, by 7 p.m. that very same day, this optimism had been completely crushed. Doug knew that Trevor would have reached town by that point, and that he would have most likely reached out like he always did. He would have answered his phone, he would have answered his text messages, but Doug hadn't been able to get in touch with him. And so because of this, Doug made a very, very scary call to the Riverside County Sheriff's Office. He makes this call, and then before he knew it, he was on the phone with the coroner's office. Doug provided them with a photo of Trevor, and when they got back to him after looking over the photo, it was confirmed that the Laher family's lives were about to change forever. The coroner positively identified the deceased hiker as Trevor. It turns out that Trevor had never made it to Idlewild. On the morning of March 27, 2020, Trevor and his trail family left their campsite, and they were excited to get the next 14 miles of trail behind them so that they could get to town, take a deep breath, and relax. At 9:30 in the morning, while the group was just below the summit of Apache Peak, they encountered a steep slope where the trail had been completely obscured by snow. The group consulted a GPS, and they realized if they traversed straight across this slope that they could rejoin the trail and they could continue on as planned. In 2022, when I hiked the PCT, there was no snow when I approached Apache Peak. However, this spot in particular still stood out to me. So much, in fact, that I actually took this video standing right next to the steep slope that I'm talking about in the rest of this story. This right here is a photo of the exact traverse which was taken the very next day. Now keep in mind that when the hikers did this traverse, those footprints or the steps that you see in the snow there, well, they wouldn't have been there. Those were from the hikers and later the rescuers that were called in because of what happened next. So Trevor and the rest of his trail family, They stared down this nerve-wracking, dangerous slope, and then they decided to just go for it. One at a time, they began to cross. The first hiker in the group made it across safely, and then they turned around and they waited for everybody else. Trevor Laher was next. Now, the snow that Trevor was about to walk across may have looked relatively stable, but hidden underneath the top layer of snow was something very, very dangerous. Folks, it was solid ice and lots of it. After taking a few steps, Trevor's foot landed right on a patch of ice, which threw him off balance. For a few moments after this, he kind of fought to regain his balance, regain his footing, and if he had been able to do so in that moment, I don't think that I would be making this video right now. However, he wasn't able to get his balance back, and he fell down onto this snowy slope. This is a very, very bad situation, but for a few moments there, he actually just kind of sat there. He remained still. And once again, if he had been able to get back on his feet at this point, I wouldn't be making this video right now. Unfortunately, Trevor wasn't able to get back up, and the conditions were so slippery that he wasn't even able to sit there long enough to really formulate a plan. Trevor began sliding uncontrollably down the slope, and he was unable to stop this sliding. He was unable to self-arrest. It didn't take long before he started slamming into rocks, and he just tumbled into a chute completely out of sight of the other hikers. So the other people that Trevor were hiking with immediately contacted rescuers when they saw this happen. They used their emergency beacons, and just a side note here, I highly recommend that every single hiker carry one of these devices. I talk about them a lot, and I always have them linked in the description of my videos, something like a Garmin InReach or a Spot device, something like that. And so they pulled out their emergency beacons, they hit the SOS button, and by the time that they reported Trevor's fall, it was 9:38 in the morning, and within an hour of this, members from the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit and the California Highway Patrol Medic and Air Operations Unit were hovering above the location, facing two very difficult tasks. Task number one was to locate Trevor and hopefully save his life. Task number two was that they had to rescue the pair of hikers who had witnessed Trevor fall, as they too were in great danger in this moment. They were essentially stranded on this dangerous icy slope. Rescuers initially wanted to extract these two hikers with the helicopter, but the windy conditions up on the mountain ended up making this basically impossible. And so the hikers just had to kind of wait there. They just waited there for instructions, they waited for rescue, and they were in such danger and so scared that they actually would end up tying themselves to trees nearby so that they too wouldn't end up sliding into the abyss like they had witnessed with Trevor. These hikers waited for hours in the freezing cold, and in a sick twist of fate, one of them actually happened to notice a Facebook notification on his phone about a PCT hiker who had died in the San Jacintos. This was hours after Trevor had fallen, and once again, this deceased hiker's name was not mentioned, but deep down, Trevor's stranded friend knew it was Trevor. These two stranded hikers waited all day before they were finally reached by a very brave search and rescue member, and they were given crampons, which allowed them to traverse the ice much more safely, and ultimately they were both hiked back down to town. But shortly after the hikers had initially called 911 and hit that SOS button, rescuers that were hovering in the sky above spotted what they thought was Trevor laying at the bottom of a gorge in an extremely remote area. I mean, he had slid very, very far, and the rescuers couldn't even really get to the area very easily. They ended up airdropping a medic at the closest safe spot that they could find, which was about 5 miles away from where Trevor was. And this, another very brave medic, very brave rescuer, hiked into Trevor's location as quickly as he possibly could. But unfortunately, by the time that this medic arrived, Trevor was gone. He had passed away at some point earlier in the day, most likely, I guess, obviously from his fall and the injuries that he sustained when he was sliding. The grief that Doug and the rest of the Laher family felt is unimaginable. I certainly can't imagine it. I mean, it's tough. It's really tough. And for Doug specifically, he actually felt more than just grief. He felt like he was in some way responsible for his son's death. He asked himself questions like, why hadn't he succeeded in persuading Trevor to leave the trail? Why hadn't he done more research about the dangers around Apache Peak and warned Trevor about this before he got there? Those are just a couple examples. Tons of questions were bouncing around in Doug's head as he struggled to come to terms with what was the greatest tragedy that he had ever experienced in his life. However, in a testament to his strength and his resilience, Doug pushed through these negative emotions and he began to kind of reframe his mindset. He obviously couldn't bring Trevor back, but what he could do was use the energy that he had spent beating himself up on a much more noble cause. A cause that would actually go on to benefit other PCT hikers that were chasing the very same dream that Trevor was. Ever since Trevor's accident, Doug has dedicated himself to educating prospective PCT hikers about safety on the trail. He's gone on podcasts to tell Trevor's story, including my podcast, by the way, which is called Trail Tales. I had him on way back in 2021. Doug has written about Trevor extensively and done his best to spread his story all over social media. And most importantly, Doug started a nonprofit called Trek for Trevor, whose mission is to, quote, promote safe hiking and exploration through preparation, awareness, and education. A major component of Trek for Trevor is a program called Trevor Spikes, which is specifically targeted at Pacific Crest Trail hikers. Trevor Spikes provides a financial stipend to northbound PCT hikers so that they can secure microspikes and ice axes. Once again, those are tools that very likely would have saved Trevor's life. It provides a stipend so that they can secure these tools before they enter the San Jacinto Mountains. Doug was very proud to share with me that last year, 143 hikers took advantage of this program, and he was proud to share that the San Jacinto section of the PCT has seen an 82% reduction in snow/ice related rescues. In addition to, just lives being saved here, this has also saved search and rescue and the taxpayer, for that matter, thousands of dollars. I'm talking like $50,000 to $75,000. Once again, I just want to drive this lesson home here. If Trevor had been wearing microspikes during his traverse on Apache Peak, and if he had been carrying an ice axe, it's very likely that he would have survived. And that's not 100% because you never know, but it's very, very likely. And if you take anything away from this video, it should be that you should always err on the side of caution when you're in the mountains. I highly encourage you to check out Trek for Trevor. They've done such a good job raising awareness, just absolutely incredible, to the point where I believe that they've changed the course of history when it comes to the Pacific Crest Trail. I'll have their site linked in the description. I've made a donation to them, and I highly recommend that you do so as well. And of course, if you're a prospective northbound PCT hiker, go check out the Trevor Spikes program because, well, it just might save your life. I'd really like to thank Doug for being so open about his loss and his pain, and for letting me make this video. Please, everybody, go show some love for him and his family in the comments. And please, please keep Trevor in your thoughts and in your hearts. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. And folks, I'll see all of you next week.